Friends, Daemon Targaryen is a ladies' man. There's no denying it. Of course, we can't believe every salacious story about Daemon set out in Fire and Blood, which is, of course, written as an unreliable and politically slanted record of history set down by the maesters of Old Town, with their known anti-Targaryen bias. However, there can be no doubt that Daemon is a dragon lord whose fires burn hot. The Rogue Prince, as he was known, is linked to no less than 5 prominent women, and maybe 6 if these Alicent rumors are true. Oh boy. But those 5 women that we're going to talk about today are Lady Rhea of House Royce in the Vale, Mysaria, also known as Lady Misery, the White Worm, Lady Laena of House Velaryon of Driftmark, Princess and Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen of Dragonstone and King's Landing, and of course Nettles, the dragon seed, quote-unquote, and dragon rider from Driftmark who claimed the wild dragon sheep stealer. In this video, I'll give you the lowdown on each of Daemon's romances, and we'll discover what kind of character each of these ladies are. Spoiler alert, they're some of the best characters in the whole story. Getting to know these women will in turn give us insight into Daemon's character beyond what we're told by the maesters, because of course, the kind of partner that someone seeks out actually tells you a lot about them, right? So hey there friends, this is David Lightbringer, thanks for clicking on the video, and this will be a mild spoilers video in that we'll be discussing the events of Fire and Blood, which is of course the book that House of the Dragon is based upon. If you want to remain completely in the dark about what's going to be on House of the Dragon, then this probably isn't the video for you. It's also important to remember that even what's in Fire and Blood isn't necessarily what's going to be on House of the Dragon because of the unreliable maester narrative, fog of history, mushroom rumors, and all that stuff. So with all that said, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you never miss a video or live stream, and let's get the show started. Alright, so first up is Lady Rhea Royce of Runestone, a storied house of First Men descent from the Vale of Arryn. The Royces, like many ancient First Men houses, were once kings, and in fact they seem to have been the chief opposition that the Andal conquerors of the Vale had to contend with, and eventually defeat in order to claim dominion over the Vale of Arryn, and also to name it the Vale of Arryn. Alright. The Royces are well known for their rune-covered bronze armor, and you may remember a fellow called Bronze Jon Royce from the main series. He's named after his bronze armor. Now, there's really not a terrible lot to say about Daemon's marriage to Lady Rhea, which occurred in 97 AC. Daemon's older brother Viserys, who of course eventually becomes king, had also married a woman of the Vale, Aemma Arryn, in 93 AC, which is only 4 years before Daemon's marriage to Lady Rhea. Oh wait, did I say Viserys married a woman of the Vale? Scratch that. Aemma Arryn was 11 at the time that she wed Viserys. Although it does say they waited a whole 2 years before the marriage was consummated, so hey, it's all good. Typical medieval stuff and definitely not creepy at all. Alright. And of course, kidding aside, the narrative is not supposed to really suggest that Viserys is some kind of pervert, but rather that this is a politically arranged marriage. And in fact, both Viserys and Aemma's marriage and Daemon and Rhea's marriage were probably political marriages that were arranged by Queen Alysanne, who was making all kinds of marriage alliances at that time. And one supposes that the goal was to strengthen ties between House Targaryen and the Vale. Now, whatever the story behind the arrangement, it doesn't seem to have been a very good match, at least not for Daemon, and this is from Fire and Blood. Prince Daemon found the Vale of Arryn boring. In the Vale, the men fuck sheep, he wrote. You cannot fault them. Their sheep are prettier than their women. And soon developed a mislike of his lady wife, whom he called my bronze bitch, after the runic armor worn by House Royce. Alright, so I know my audience, and some of you may be thinking my bronze bitch is actually kind of a boss nickname for a warrior lady with magic runic armor, but it seems that's not how it was intended. Indeed, when Viserys took the throne in 103 AC, Daemon actually lobbied his brother to have his marriage set aside. Viserys refused, but allowed Daemon to return to King's Landing and take up a small council position, or series of positions, as it would turn out. So Daemon and Lady Rhea were estranged, more or less, until Rhea's death in 115 AC, an event which was accounted a tragic mishap by the maesters writing Fire and Blood. Lady Rhea fell off her horse while hunting in the Vale, you see, though the maesters can't help but speculate whether or not Daemon might have arranged for her murder and tried to cover it up as an accident. I discussed Lady Rhea's death in more detail in the Anti-Dragon Maester Conspiracy Part 2 video, if you'd like more on that. But the main point is that when Lady Rhea passed from this mortal coil, Daemon showed up at Runestone, ostensibly to lay claim to her lands via marriage. The Royces were having none of that, though, and neither was Jane Arryn, Lady of the Vale, to whom Daemon appealed. Now, we don't really know much about Rhea Royce, the character, and since her marriage to Daemon was probably a political one, it doesn't really tell us a lot about Daemon, save that he wasn't the type to spend his entire life with one woman that he didn't particularly like, simply for reasons of state. Or, put more simply, a dragon is not a slave. Now, the quote about the sheep of the Vale being better looking than their women is no doubt an authentic Daemonism, seeing as how it says that Daemon wrote those words, presumably in a letter to his brother Viserys in King's Landing. And one hopes this is a line of dialogue that will make it into the show. There's not much dialogue in Fire and Blood, but you would think they would use this one. In any case, there's actually a small layer of irony here, since it seems that the first Valyrians were probably shepherds who probably fed the dragon's sheep to help tame them, just as Nettles the dragon seed does later on in the story of Fire and Blood, and we'll get to Nettles later in this video. Setting aside Daemon's elitist views of shepherds and what they do to pass the time out there in the lonely fields, it's safe to say that Daemon clearly wasn't impressed by the Vale of Arryn or his bronze bitch, Lady Rhea, as he sired no children with her and never even really established himself in the Vale. In fact, after Lady Rhea's death, Lady Jane Arryn gave Daemon the boot from the entire Vale altogether and told him he was persona non grata. Thank you very much. So now, rewinding back about a decade to 103 and 104 AC, I mentioned that Daemon returned to King's Landing and took up a series of small council positions. It was 3, actually. He briefly served as Master of Laws and then Master of Coin, but didn't do very well with those, apparently, and was removed from those positions by Viserys on the advice of his hand, Sir Otto Hightower, who is, of course, the president of the Daemon Targaryen "I am not one of your fans" club. I'm not only the president, I'm also a client. Daemon was then famously appointed to lead the City Watch, and here he excelled and transformed the Watch into the much better armed, better trained, and more capable Gold Cloak Watch that we all know and love from Game of Thrones. In fact, they were probably a little tougher back in Daemon's day. So this is where Daemon meets the second of his ladies and the first of his romances, and that would be Mysaria, also known as Misery the White Worm. Mysaria was said to be a Lysene dancing girl, which probably means that not only was she a sex worker, but that she was probably also sold into that profession. Lysene sex workers are generally slaves unless they've sort of bought their way to freedom, which is very rare. And I also did see an interview with the actress Sonia Mizuno, if I'm saying that right, where she referred to Mysaria as a character that's been sold and sold again, so yeah. At the point of the story where she's in King's Landing, she's probably no longer enslaved to anyone, but we'll just have to see how the character is played on the show. In any case, this choice seems to be a bit more reflective of Daemon's personality. I mean, Mysaria is clearly no highborn lady, and by the end of the story, it seems pretty clear that she's some kind of sorceress or magical person of some kind. As you can see, the early release photos of Mysaria seem to show her wearing a weirwood embroidered dress, or at least a white tree embroidered dress, and you can see the leaves there on the inner part. So it's possible that the HBO version of the story in House of the Dragon will reveal some kind of connection to weirwood magic for Mysaria. She's incredibly well connected in Flea Bottom and elsewhere, and later in the story serves as an unofficial master of whisperers to Rhaenyra and Daemon, not unlike Varys from the main series. Mysaria will definitely be an interesting character for the showrunners to flesh out, as basically everything we know about her is shrouded in mystery and controversy. So then comes 105 AC and the death of Viserys' wife, Queen Aemma Arryn. Daemon has been captain of the Watch for over a year now, and he's often seen about the low places of the city with Mysaria. Tragically, Queen Aemma dies while giving birth to Viserys' son, with the babe dying shortly after his mother. Yes, it's very sad, and supposedly Daemon was overheard in a brothel japing about the heir for a day, with the idea being that Daemon was, of course, technically Viserys' heir until Viserys had a son. And so Daemon would have only lost his position as heir for the day that Viserys' son had been alive. Yes, it's a very rude joke, but you can see that Daemon is potentially taking offense that Viserys is trying to replace him as heir by having sons, I guess. We'll have to see. In any case, Viserys was furious when he found out, and he promptly named Rhaenyra his heir instead of Daemon, seemingly to spite Daemon. And so, Daemon, showing all the good grace one would expect, hopped on the back of his dragon Caraxes with Mysaria and flew to Dragonstone. And that's almost certainly what we're seeing in this clip here, with Daemon and Mysaria on Caraxes' back. Good Caraxes, who's a good boy. Daemon and Mysaria remain on Dragonstone for half a year, with Mysaria eventually becoming pregnant with Daemon's child. Here, Daemon runs into trouble with Viserys and his advisors like Sir Otto and the Unfunky Bunch when he presents his pregnant paramour, Mysaria, with a dragon's egg, which is of course a tradition usually meant for the official ladies of House Targaryen, if you will. From this act, we can infer that Daemon saw Mysaria as essentially equal to a Targaryen princess, and esteemed her and treated her as he would a royal lady. That actually speaks well of Daemon, since we, the more modern audience, tend to see through the trappings of class and high society, and all the sorts of things that say, this person can't marry that person because they are too low-born, or because they have a naughty occupation. So Daemon, he's open-minded, let's just say that. But his brother, King Viserys, well, he was not impressed. He's the king, so he's not exactly looking to lead a Marxist class uprising, now is he? And so Viserys commanded Daemon to return the dragon's egg and to send Mysaria away, and also to return to the warm company of his beloved Lady Rhea in the Vale. Unfortunately, Mysaria suffered a miscarriage while on the ship taking her back to Lys, and this further angered Daemon and alienated the two brothers from one another. So then later on in the story, when Rhaenyra takes King's Landing during the war, Mysaria turns up again, somewhat mysteriously. And this is the time when she served Rhaenyra and Daemon as their unofficial master of whisperers. It's hard to say when she actually returned, quote-unquote, to King's Landing. That's kind of the mystery of Mysaria. But she apparently still had extensive contacts all throughout the city, amongst the highborn and the low. And she was probably the one who hired the assassins Blood and Cheese. So it's likely that Mysaria never really went away for too long. It says that she had, quote, grown more stout by this time, but she apparently still commanded Daemon's attention and affection. And in fact, it seems that Rhaenyra, whom Daemon was married to by now, was basically fine with Daemon sleeping with Mysaria when he wished, based on what the maesters tell us in Fire and Blood. Though the years had thickened the body that had been so lithe and lissome, Prince Daemon remained in her thrall and called upon her every evening, with Queen Rhaenyra's apparent blessing. Let Daemon slake his hungers where he will, she is reported to have said, and we shall do the same. There's actually a little bit more to say about Mysaria, but we'll come back to her later on in the video. All right, the third of Daemon's ladies, well, it's debatable who is third, because although Daemon married Laena Velaryon in 115 AC, after the death of Lady Rhea, it also seems that some kind of affection developed between Daemon and Rhaenyra before then. Now, the phrase affection developed is kind of a placeholder for a giant mystery box, controversy, who knows what actually happened type thing, since the Daemon-Rhaenyra relationship is a complex and sticky issue that, again, we don't know the real story of. Daemon and Rhaenyra, of course, end up married to one another before the war starts, but their story seems to begin much earlier, in 111 AC, when Rhaenyra is 14 and Daemon is 31. I want to be careful what I say here, since, again, we don't really know what happened. Fire and Blood gives us several possible truths for everything, and until we see what truth the House of the Dragon showrunners decide to portray, it's probably not smart to prejudge the matter based on the salacious rumor-mongerings of Mushroom. So what matters this? Well, it's that thing where Daemon kinda, sorta, maybe taught 14-year-old Rhaenyra a bunch of sex stuff so that she could try to seduce Sir Criston Cole, who was a Knight of the Kingsguard and thus sworn to chastity. But maybe Daemon was actually grooming or seducing Rhaenyra himself, or maybe it was simply that Daemon and Rhaenyra were lovers and were found to bed together, with Rhaenyra then pleading to her father to let her marry Daemon? Or maybe nothing like any of that. It's just hard to know until we see what they do on the show, but the bottom line is that we know Daemon returns to King's Landing after many years away, reconciles with his brother Viserys, and then promptly begins hanging out with his niece Rhaenyra quite a bit, only to be exiled again half a year later for some mysterious reason. Here is Fire and Blood, describing Daemon's return to King's Landing and the attention he paid Rhaenyra. Daemon spent long hours in her company, enthralling her with tales of his journeys and battles. He gave her pearls and silks and a jade tiara said once to have belonged to the Empress of Lang, read poems to her, dined with her, talked with her, sailed with her, entertained her by making mock of greens at court, the lickspittles fawning over Queen Alicent and her children. He praised her beauty, declaring her to be the fairest maid in all the 7 kingdoms. Uncle and niece began to fly together almost daily, racing Syrax against Caraxes to Dragonstone and back. So look, these are Targaryens. Obviously, it sounds kind of gross for us to hear about an uncle seducing his niece. But of course, uncle and niece or aunt and nephew pairings are not uncommon in Targaryen history. Daenerys is Jon's aunt, if you recall. Now, even setting that aside, there is of course the issue of the age difference and Rhaenyra's potential youth and inexperience, which would create a pretty massive power imbalance. However, at age 14 and having been raised in court, and having been a dragon rider for over 7 years, Rhaenyra is not exactly some kind of naive, sheltered girl either. She's much more advanced than, say, Sansa was when she came to King's Landing, for example. And Rhaenyra was considered a lady and a full-grown woman by Westerosi pseudo-medieval custom. I also mentioned on the recent episode 1 review that I put out that Rhaenyra is a character that we can already tell has a lot of agency, so she shouldn't be considered just sort of an innocent character who's being manipulated by all the powerful men around her. She's got a lot of fire in her belly as well. Now, all that is to say that this is a complicated and potentially controversial pairing, and we'll pretty much just have to wait and see what happens on the show and reserve judgment until then. But at the very least, you can see that something is happening here. I mean, Daemon is declaring Rhaenyra the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. He's showering her with exotic gifts, and most importantly, flying around with her on their dragons and teaching her what it's like to be a dragon lord, one presumes. This sounds like it could potentially have the hallmarks of a romance. And of course, we know that they do end up getting married later in life, about a decade later. So there's little doubt that some sort of romance did begin here with Daemon and Rhaenyra in 111 AC. It may have been as serious as Rhaenyra asking her father for approval to marry Daemon. That's the Septon Eustace version, where Daemon took Rhaenyra's virginity and they were caught abed by Sir Auric Cargill of the Kingsguard and brought before the king. And we may be seeing some version of that event here in this clip where Daemon is being thrown down by a knight of the Kingsguard in his small clothes. That's Daemon in his small clothes, not the Kingsguard. That would be silly. Now, Daemon was still married to Rhea Royce at this time, and of course, part of the point of Viserys having made Rhaenyra his heir in the first place was to make Daemon not the heir. So he wasn't about to approve of Daemon marrying Rhaenyra and then being in line to become the prince consort when Rhaenyra took the throne. Now, Mushroom, after recounting the far more salacious Daemon trained Rhaenyra to seduce Sir Criston version of the incident, claims that Daemon himself asked Viserys for permission to marry Rhaenyra after the scandal broke, saying, "Give the girl to me to wife. Who else would have her now?" So again, it's quite the mess. Maybe. Or maybe it's as simple as Daemon and Rhaenyra falling in love and being denied the freedom to marry. Or maybe this is all just a fantasy of Mushroom. We'll just have to wait and see. So when Daemon and Rhaenyra finally do marry, it's in secret on Dragonstone. And just as we've seen in the trailer shots, it was supposedly done in the old Valyrian style. We aren't told quite what that means, although clearly it involves a bit of Blood Brothers style hand wounding to seal the covenant, and I would expect some level of incantation or sorcery here as well. All Valyrian sorcery is rooted in fire and blood, so if I see bloodshed in a Valyrian ritual, I can only assume that sorcery is afoot. Daemon and Rhaenyra, for better or worse, are certainly a prime example of a Dragon Lord power couple, much like Prince Balon and Princess Alyssa, Daemon and Viserys' parents, like King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, like the Conquerors, Aegon and Rhaenys and Visenya, and eventually, like Jon and Daenerys, the saviors of the Long Night. Daemon and Rhaenyra will wage war together, take King's Landing together, and, for a time at least, rule together. The show is, in many ways, building towards that moment, so I'm sure they'll craft the twists and turns of the Daemon and Rhaenyra relationship with care. It's definitely one of the biggest things to watch for in Season 1 of House of the Dragon. All right, to meet Daemon's fourth lady, let's move back in time a little bit to 111 AC, right after whatever this scandal was with Daemon and Rhaenyra and Kristen Cole that resulted in Daemon being sent away from King's Landing into exile for the second time. After returning to the Stepstones and the little kingdom that he carved out with Corlys Velaryon, oh yes, didn't you know? While Daemon was passing time away from King's Landing during his first exile, it seems that Daemon and Caraxes taught the free cities of Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh a lesson, again with the help of Corlys Velaryon's mighty fleet, and conquered his way to the title King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. That's a tale for another day, although we know already that this will be covered in Season 1 of House of the Dragon. But the bottom line is that when Viserys exiled Daemon for the second time, Daemon had already established his seat on Bloodstone Island in the Stepstones, and he simply returned there and went back to playing king. So then, a few years later, comes 115 AC and the death of Rhea Royce. After Daemon was booted from the Vale of Arryn by both the Royces and the Arryns, he flies over to Driftmark to swap war stories with Corlys Velaryon, I guess, and oh, hello. How'd you do, Lady Laena, is it? I heard you like to fly dragons. I jest, but it was apparently love at first sight, according to the singers. Shout out George Michael. Now, unfortunately, I had planned on cueing the saxophone from Careless Whisper, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, whenever I talked about the romantic parts of the story, but unfortunately, YouTube copyright strikes. So if you could just sort of imagine the music in your head while I read the romantic parts, that would be appreciated. Thank you. The Maesters, of course, suggest that Daemon was simply trying to check his political fall. But consider that this is the guy who openly made a Lyseni sex worker his paramour and gave her unborn son a dragon's egg just because he felt like it. Clearly, this is a man who prioritizes his own desires over political prudence, as that act obviously didn't make him a better candidate for the throne, which was the goal that he was ostensibly lusting for. Although I definitely have my doubts about that. And even more than that, Daemon and Laena just plain old look like a real romance. Laena is 22 and an incredible beauty, known for wearing her hair in ringlets, and it's definitely cool that they kept that detail for House of the Dragon. At the age of 12, when Laena was proposed as a candidate to wed King Viserys after Queen Aemma's death, it was already said of Laena that, quote, she had inherited the beauty of a true Targaryen from her mother, Rhaenys, and a bold, adventurous spirit from her father, the Sea Snake. And the small council felt sure that she would make, quote, a splendid queen. It also says in Fire and Blood that, as Lord Corlys loved to sail, Laena loved to fly, and had claimed for her own no less amount than mighty Vhagar, the oldest and largest of the Targaryen dragons since the passing of the Black Dread in 94 AC. So Laena was showing all that promise at the age of 12. So by the age of 22, there's little doubt that she would have knocked Daemon's Valyrian steel socks right off. And it's also not hard to see how Daemon might have impressed Laena right back. I mean, here is someone with a similar wild, impetuous dragon nature, but who is more actualized about it. And Daemon has even gone to war and proven himself to be a true dragon. There was just one small problem. Laena had been betrothed to some loser for the last 10 years. And by loser, I mean the son of a Sea Lord of Braavos who had kinda just run out of money and sort of just kept hanging around Driftmark. Yeah. Embarrassing. Anyway, Daemon was only there a couple of weeks before he decided to go ahead and just sort that one out. Daemon mocked him to his face so savagely that the boy had no choice but to call him to defend his words with steel. Armed with Dark Sister, the prince made short work of his rival and wed Lady Laena Velaryon a fortnight later, abandoning his hardscrabble kingdom on the Stepstones. Alright, well, I'm sure House of the Dragon will have fun depicting that one. Definitely a quintessential Daemon Targaryen moment. In any case, Daemon and Laena then go on a very cool Dragon Rider tour of various SOC cities. First to nearby Pentos, and then down to Volantis, and then up the Rhoyne and its many ruins to the northern cities of Qohor and Norvos, and then back to Pentos, with Laena becoming pregnant with the twins Baela and Rhaena during their second stay there. It sounds like quite the Dragon Lord honeymoon, and Fire and Blood even adds that Some say they flew to Valeria in defiance of the curse that hung over that smoking wasteland, to search out the secrets of the dragon lords of the old freehold. When I first read that, I figured it wasn't true, but now that I've seen how much they are building up the Valyrian lore on House of the Dragon, I can't help but wonder if maybe in the show version, Daemon and Laena will fly to Valeria. And in fact, let's make that a prediction. I hereby predict that Daemon and Laena will visit Valeria and perhaps collect some sort of artifact or see something interesting or relevant that will help the show build up our knowledge of Valyrian lore. Now, Daemon and Laena are together for several happy years, it seems, during which time Rhaenyra visited them on Driftmark, flying over on her dragon Syrax from nearby Dragonstone, and you can see from the map they are very close to one another. And one presumes that Laena's older brother and Rhaenyra's husband, Laenor, would sometimes join them on his dragon Seasmoke. These were probably the happiest moments of all of their lives, to be honest, and it wasn't long before Daemon and Laena betrothed their young daughters, Baela and Rhaena, to Jacaerys and Lucerys, Rhaenyra's two oldest sons by her husband Laenor, or perhaps Harwin Strong, her lover, which is, of course, an entirely different controversy. Now, as anyone who has read Fire and Blood knows, Jace and Luke do not survive the war, but Baela and Rhaena do, and they both go on to marry other people and, of course, have very full and impactful lives. That's especially comforting to know because, of course, their mother Laena, Daemon's wife, also dies long before her time, and in fact several years before the war even begins. Laena suffers complications while giving birth to the son that Daemon had always longed for, during a year in which several important people tragically died, and it's called the Year of the Red Spring for that reason. I'm not sure exactly how close House of the Dragon will stick to the exact timeline in Fire and Blood, but the key development here is that Laenor Velaryon, Rhaenyra's husband, and Harwin Strong, Rhaenyra's lover, both die soon after Laena does, and that leaves Daemon and Rhaenyra both alone and bereft, and ultimately on a collision course to marry one another, which they do later that same year in 120 AC. Laena's death, as described in Fire and Blood, does have a nice poetic flourish, so I'll read it to you now. During her final hour, Lady Laena rose from her bed, pushed away the septas praying over her, and made her way from her room, intent on reaching Vhagar that she might fly one last time before she died. Her strength failed her on the tower steps, however, and it was there that she collapsed and died. Her husband, Prince Daemon, carried her back to bed. All right, last but not least is Nettles, and shout out to Girl Nettles, one of my two co-hosts along with Grey Waste Tim, for the House of Flying D's House of the Dragon live after show, which will be, as the name indicates, live after the show every week, right here on this channel. In any case, Nettles is one of the coolest characters in the story, all fans agree. And of course, she is one of the so-called Dragon Seeds who came forward to try to claim a dragon on behalf of Rhaenyra's cause during the war. Nettles hasn't been cast yet, as she doesn't really come into the story until after the war begins. But she does play a pretty large part, and she definitely will be on the show. And yeah, in case you didn't know, Nettles is just an awesome character. I mean, at a certain point during the war, it occurs to Rhaenyra and Daemon that, well, there's all kinds of Targaryen bastards running around Dragonstone and Driftmark, and that a few of them might be found to ride these several unclaimed dragons that are lurking about, thereby adding a few more dragons to Rhaenyra's cause. Seems like a good idea. Now, 3 of the riderless dragons were castle-bred and had previously been ridden, and those would be Vermithor, Silverwing, and Seasmoke. And there were also 3 wild dragons who had never been tamed, and that would be the Cannibal, Grey Ghost, and Sheepstealer, a vicious, ill-tempered beast who had killed more seeds than the 3 castle dragons together. And here's a bit more about Sheepstealer from Fire and Blood. In the end, the brown dragon was brought to heel by the cunning and persistence of a small brown girl of 6 and 10, who delivered him a freshly slaughtered sheep every morning until Sheepstealer learned to accept and expect her. Munkin sets down the name of this unlikely dragon rider as Nettles. Mushroom tells us the girl was a bastard of uncertain birth called Nettie, born to a dockside whore. By any name, she was black-haired, brown-eyed, brown-skinned, skinny, foul-mouthed, fearless, and the first and last rider of the dragon Sheepstealer. So as you can see, Nettles is a pretty likable character. That's what it means when someone's written to be foul-mouthed. We're supposed to like them. They're endearing, they're rugged, salt of the earth. Anyways, Nettles probably ends up becoming the 5th high-profile lover of Prince Daemon Targaryen, who is now the Lord Protector of the realm and Prince Consort to Queen Rhaenyra. It's not 100%, and some people think that Nettles is actually Daemon's bastard and that the closeness is a father-daughter thing, but it seems more to me like a romance. But we'll have to see what they do on the show, as I keep saying. In Fire and Blood, we learn that Daemon and Nettles go to war together near the end of the war. They go off to battle, hunting Aemond One-Eye and his dragon Vhagar. And it seems that they might be falling into a romantic relationship during that time, although again, there is a huge age gap, with Daemon being 49 and Nettles 16. And this is perhaps one of the reasons people think that maybe she's actually his bastard daughter and not his lover. So, kind of like Rhaenyra, Nettles is a teenager, but she's also a dragon rider, and a very unique one. To tame the mighty sheep stealer, for example, she used the classic animal training method that has worked for thousands of years in the real world: food and consistency. That's pretty awesome, and makes a lot of sense, frankly. I mean, whether or not Nettles has a bit of dragon blood is anyone's guess, and we don't even know how the dragon bond works for sure. But dragons are animals, and they're always hungry, and any intelligent animal can be tamed or at least trained to some extent with food. Although I don't recommend keeping tigers as pets. However, I do want to ask the question, was it actually only food that Nettles used? On the day that she and Daemon parted company for the last time, near the end of the war and right before Daemon's final battle, it kind of sounds like Nettles is doing a little more than feeding her dragon here, but take a listen and you be the judge. How the prince and his bastard girl spent their last night beneath Lord Muton's roof is not recorded, but as dawn broke, they appeared together in the yard, and Prince Daemon helped Nettles saddle Sheep Stealer one last time. It was her custom to feed him each day before she flew. Dragons bend easier to their riders when full. That morning she fed him a black ram, the largest in Maidenpool, slitting the ram's throat herself. Her riding leathers were stained with blood when she mounted her dragon, Maester Norrin records. Her cheeks stained with tears. No word of farewell was spoken betwixt man and maid, but as Sheep Stealer beat his leathery brown wings and climbed into the dawn sky, Caraxes raised his head and gave a scream that shattered every window in Jonquil's tower. High above the town, Nettles turned her dragon toward the Bay of Crabs and vanished into the morning mists, never to be seen again at court or castle. This really sounds like some witchy shit is going on here to me. I mean, not just slaughtering a black ram and offering it to the dragon, who would have lit it on fire in order to cook it, of course, but how about Nettles covering herself with the ram's blood before mounting the dragon? Is this perhaps the account of a maester witnessing sorcery without understanding what he's seeing? Because this sounds like it could definitely be part of a spell, and perhaps this is actually how Nettles trained Sheep Stealer originally, not just by feeding him sheep, but by using blood magic to perhaps create her very own dragon bond. And is this perhaps closer to how the original Velaryons, who again seem to have been shepherds, would have created the first dragon bonds among them? So sorry to backslide into theory crafting when we're supposed to be focusing on romance, but it is also kind of a romantic passage. Her cheeks stained with tears as fate and tragedy forces her to part from her probably lover. Caraxes' scream channeling Daemon's pain and shattering all the windows in Jonquil's tower, with that last bit and their location near Maidenpool being a cunning reference to the Shakespearean in-world romantic legend of Florian and Jonquil, which, by the way, I take as a clue that this was a romantic relationship. This passage also shows what an interesting character Nettles is, just by way of the conversations that she prompts about dragon riding, the dragon bond, and Valyrian blood magic. Alright, so if you were waiting for some sort of awkward sitcom moment where too many of Daemon's ladies all end up at the same party, if you will, we get something like that here in King's Landing during the war. Rhaenyra, who is either Daemon's third or fourth famous lover, is debating whether or not Nettles, who is secretly Daemon's fifth famous lover, probably, can be trusted after the betrayal of Dragonseed's Hardhue Hammer and Ulf the White. When who should walk in but Daemon's second famous lover, Mysaria. Queen Rhaenyra did not act at once, but rather sent for Mysaria, the harlot and dancing girl who was her mistress of whisperers in all but name. Lady Mysaria appeared before the council in a hooded robe of black velvet, lined with blood-red silk, and stood with head bowed humbly as her grace asked whether she thought Sir Adam and Nettles might be planning to betray them. Then the white worm raised her eyes and said in a soft voice, "The girl has already betrayed you, my queen. Even now she shares your husband's bed, and soon enough she will have his bastard in her belly." All right, so anytime someone uses that dramatic "even now" phrasing, you know they're a Grima Wormtongue-esque manipulator, right? And it seems to work. Rhaenyra is properly Queen of Hearts level angry here, ordering Sir Adam's arrest and Nettles' execution, saying, "She is a common thing, with the stink of sorcery upon her," the queen declared. "My prince would never lay with such a low creature." Which, by the way, is kind of awkward, cutting in for a second, standing as she is next to Mysaria, who would fit that same definition, low-born, with the stink of sorcery upon her, and someone Daemon repeatedly slept with, but I digress. Rhaenyra continues, "You need only to look at her to know she has no drop of dragon's blood in her. It was with spells that she bound a dragon to her, and she has done the same with my lord husband." All right, so here's one of the big clues, of course, about Nettles potentially using sorcery to claim her dragon. Rhaenyra says it directly. However, I'm highly doubtful that Nettles needed to use any sorcery to entrance Daemon. By now, we have a pretty good idea of what kind of lady Daemon likes. Ones who aren't necessarily ladies in the classic sense, but being a dragon lord sure helps. And also maybe being younger than Daemon. Yeah. Anyway, you get the feeling that Nettles struck Daemon as someone who, despite her non-Valyrian looks, probably embodied the essence of what he thought a dragon lord should be. I mean, we're talking about someone who tamed and rode a wild dragon with nothing but her wits and maybe a little blood magic. And someone who had already taken her dragon to war and proven herself. And if Nettles was familiar with sorcery, well, she wouldn't have needed to use it on Daemon. Daemon would have counted it as a plus, simply because he seems to be interested in sorcery himself, and obviously not shy of dating sorceress women. And yes, that's the sequel to Dangerous Women, Sorceress Women. You're welcome, George. Seriously though, that would be pretty good, right? You'd read that, right? The anthology called Sorceress Women. I mean, who's not buying? In any case, Rhaenyra does indeed send out the order to Lord Mouton of Maidenpool to have Nettles executed and Daemon sent back to King's Landing. And that's the reason why Daemon and Nettles were parting tearfully in the yard in that quote that I just read earlier. Lord Mouton, put in a very bad position, wisely chose to use his maester to covertly warn Daemon and Nettles so that he wouldn't be caught facing the wrath of an angry dragon lord whose lover he had just murdered in her sleep, which, was probably the right call. And although it's true that Nettles was never seen again in court or castle, she may have become the so-called Fire Witch, to whom the Burned Men, a wildling clan in the Mountains of the Moon in the Vale, swore their oaths to for a time, though that's a theory for another day. And actually, I explored that one a bit in the Firewhite's Watch video, if you want to check that out. It's part of the Melisandre's Secrets series, which you can find on the front page of the YouTube channel. Another thing that I really like about Nettles is her very human reaction to the horrific experience of using a dragon that you're riding to burn people alive, which, someone had to give us, #Team Smallfolk. This next quote occurs directly following the Battle of the Gullet early on in the war, and this is the first time that all the new dragon riders are brought to bear for Rhaenyra's side. Ulf the White and Hard Hugh Hammer are reveling in their triumph and in their power, and we read this. The girl Nettles did not share their celebrations. She had flown with the others, fought as bravely, burned and killed as they had, but her face was black with smoke and streaked with tears when she returned to Dragonstone. So in direct contrast to Sir Hugh and Ulf the White, Nettles is clearly horrified and revulsed by witnessing dragon warfare up close. Like I said, this is really the decent human reaction to have, and another reason why we like Nettles. And by the way, just to keep the timeline sorted out, it's not until sometime after this that Daemon and Nettles are going to war together. All right, well, as you can see, Daemon has quite the active love life. And again, there's a rumor about him and Alicent. Maybe he's the father of Aemond One-Eye, whom you can see from the casting choice on the show. They picked someone that looks a lot like Daemon, so maybe there's something there. But regardless, Daemon is linked to many of the coolest female characters in the story. Of the 4 lovers that he chose, 3 were dragon riders, 2 were linked to sorcery, and 1 was a queen. 2 of them were highborn to great houses descending from old Valyria, and 2 of them were as lowborn as they come. One of them rode the mightiest dragon alive at that time, and another tamed a vicious wild dragon that no one else could. So what do these romances say about Daemon? Well, that he was a true dragon in the classic sense. Wild, impetuous, daring, haughty, controversial, carnal, and at times carefree. And as much as anything, Daemon's ladies tell that story. All right, thanks for watching, folks. If you made it all the way to the end of this longer video, check out the House of the Dragon playlist and all the other awesome playlists on the YouTube channel for deep Song of Ice and Fire lore, character analysis, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de. And I'll see you again very soon with more House of the Dragon videos and live streams, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel, folks.